June 18th, 1944, Florida. The smell of coffee drifted through the barracks before the sun fully rose. It reached me before the sound did, before boots on gravel, before the low murmur of voices outside, before the bugle somewhere beyond the trees. Coffee. Thin, almost watery, but unmistakably coffee. The kind that clings to the back of your throat and makes you swallow even when you're not hungry. For a moment, still half asleep on the narrow cot, I thought I was dreaming. Or, worse, remembering something that no longer existed. Home. Before the war. Before ration cards and burned kitchens and mornings that tasted like nothing. But then I heard it. A spoon tapping the rim of a tin cup. Not shouted, not slammed, just a small, ordinary sound. Metal touching metal, steady and unhurried, someone stirring. I opened my eyes. The ceiling above me was wooden, pale planks nailed in straight lines. No cracks, no leaks. A faint spiderweb in the corner, undisturbed. Sunlight crept through the narrow window slats, thin and golden, cutting the dust in the air into soft ribbons. Somewhere down the row of bunks, another woman shifted, the mattress spring sighing under her weight. This was not how prison mornings were supposed to begin. Back in Germany, they had prepared us carefully for capture. Not officially, not in writing, but through whispers, posters, radio broadcasts that played between marches and air raid sirens. The Americans torture prisoners. They humiliate women. They starve you, break you, turn you into animals. I had believed every word. So when I was taken, when the transport ship crossed the Atlantic and the water stretched on longer than my fear could count, I had folded myself inward and waited for the moment it would begin. The shouting, the beatings, the stripping away of anything that reminded me I was still human. But instead, I woke up in Florida. To coffee. I sat up slowly, careful not to make noise. The wooden floor beneath my bare feet was cool, recently swept. You could tell by the faint lines left behind, the way dust had been pushed into the corners with intention. In Europe, floors were swept only when someone was coming to inspect, or when you were trying to hide something. Here, it seemed to be done simply because morning had arrived. Across the room, a calendar hung crookedly on a nail. Someone, an American hand, judging by the blunt pencil marks, had circled the date. June 18th, and beneath it, written in block letters so clear they almost felt aggressive in their neatness. Sunday. I stared at the word longer than I should have. Sunday meant church bells. It meant family sitting together. It meant bread if you were lucky, soup if you weren't. It meant a pause in the week, a recognition that not all days were meant to be endured. Why would a prison need Sundays? Outside, a door opened. I instinctively tensed, shoulders tightening, breath catching in my chest. This was the moment, I thought. The sound that would change everything. But the voices that followed were calm. English, yes. Foreign. Rough around the edges. But not sharp. Not angry. One of the guards passed the open doorway. I saw him only for a second, framed by sunlight. He wore his rifle slung loosely over his shoulder, not raised, not even touched. What caught my eye instead was his wrist. A watch, leather strap, scuffed, practical. He glanced at it, then at the sky, as if measuring time rather than asserting control. He did not look into the barracks, did not count us, did not shout. He simply walked on. I sat there, heart pounding, trying to understand why that unsettled me more than cruelty ever could. In the camps, we had been warned about, the ones whispered about in darker tones. Guards carried whips, batons, dogs. Their power was always visible, always pressing down on you like a hand on the back of your neck. Here, power seemed absent, or worse, unnecessary. The smell of coffee grew stronger as someone passed along the walkway outside, carrying a dented aluminum pot. I could hear the liquid slosh inside, thin but generous. Another sound followed. Bread being set down on a surface, the soft thud of something heavier than ration crackers. My stomach betrayed me, twisting sharply. I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been holding myself together until that moment. I stood and approached the window, careful, cautious. Beyond the barracks, the camp stretched out under the rising sun. Palm trees stood in loose rows, their shadows long and lazy on the ground. The air already felt warm, thick with moisture and the distant scent of earth. This was Florida. I had seen it once on a map, a shape like a pointing finger jutting into the sea. It had never occurred to me that I might wake up here as a prisoner of war. 2 guards stood near a table set up outside. One poured coffee into tin cups. The other checked names on a clipboard. No shouting, no rushing. They moved like men starting another day of work, not like captors overseeing enemies. One of the women behind me whispered, barely audible. "Is this a trick?" I didn't answer. I didn't know how. Everything about the scene felt wrong, not chaotic, not violent, just wrong in a quieter, more dangerous way. Because if this was real, if this was truly how Americans treated prisoners, then something fundamental we had been taught was breaking apart. I had prepared myself to be reduced, to be stripped of dignity, of routine, of small comforts. Instead, I was being confronted with them. Coffee in the morning, clean floors, time measured by watches, not fear, a calendar that acknowledged Sunday. I pressed my fingers against the window frame. The wood was smooth, sanded down. Someone had cared enough to make it that way. I am a prisoner, I reminded myself silently. But nothing around me agreed. This did not look like a prison. It looked, terrifyingly, like the beginning of an ordinary American day. And that was the first shock. Not the barbed wire, not the guards, but the realization that captivity, here, wore the face of normal life, and I did not yet know which frightened me more. The strangest part was not what the Americans did. It was what they didn't do. After that first morning, the coffee, the calm voices, the calendar with Sunday written in careful block letters, we all waited. Not together, not openly, but in the quiet, private way people wait when they have been trained to expect pain. We waited for the correction. Because kindness, we had been taught, never lasted. Back in the barracks, after breakfast trays were collected and the guards moved on, the silence returned. Not a peaceful silence, a tense one. The kind that presses against your ears and makes every small sound feel like a warning. I sat on my cot and folded my hands in my lap, forcing myself not to look toward the door. That was how it always began in the stories. First, they fed you. Then they came for you. At night. I knew those stories by heart. Germany, 1943-1944, was a country living on echoes. Echoes of bombers overhead. Echoes of speeches crackling through radios powered by failing electricity. Echoes of promises that grew louder as the shelves grew emptier. By then, we had learned to sleep in our clothes. You never knew when the sirens would start, or when the walls would shake hard enough to bring plaster down on your hair. My last winter before capture had smelled of coal dust and boiled turnips. Bread was dark, heavy, stretched with anything that could be ground fine enough to disappear into flour. Meat had become a rumor, but the propaganda never starved. It arrived on time, every time. The Americans are brutal. They break prisoners for sport. Women fare worse. We were shown drawings, heard testimonies from voices we never saw, told that capture meant humiliation before death, that mercy was weakness, and Americans were weak in the wrong ways and cruel in all the others. So when I found myself in a clean barracks in Florida, fed and untouched, my mind rejected the evidence of my senses. This was not mercy. This was preparation. The first night, I did not sleep. Every time footsteps passed outside, my muscles tightened. When a guard laughed somewhere down the path, just a quick burst of sound, probably at a joke I couldn't understand, I flinched so hard my shoulders ached. They would come in the dark, I told myself. They always came in the dark. I kept my small possessions lined neatly at the foot of the cot. A folded scarf. A photograph I had managed to hide during transport. A bar of soap issued that morning. The soap troubled me the most. It was pale, smooth, wrapped in plain paper, and it smelled wrong. Not the sharp chemical sting of the soap we had used at home. This one carried something softer, almost sweet, clean in a way that felt unnecessary, wasteful even. I turned it over in my hands, suspicious. They give this now, I thought, so they can take it away later. Morning came again, and then another. No beatings, no screams, no numbers stitched to our clothes. Instead, names. The first time it happened, I didn't realize what I was hearing. A guard stood outside with a clipboard calling us out for work detail. His accent bent the sound strangely, but there was no mistaking the intention. Elise Hartman. I froze. For a moment I was certain I had misunderstood, that I had imagined it. But then he looked up, scanning faces, waiting, not impatiently, not angrily, waiting for me. I stepped forward on unsteady legs. "Yes," I said, barely audible. He nodded once and marked something on his paper. No reaction, no smirk, no emphasis. Just a name, acknowledged. I had been prepared to lose many things in captivity: food, comfort, safety. I had not been prepared to lose my anonymity so gently. Numbers were efficient. Numbers erased individuality. Numbers made cruelty easier. Names did the opposite. Work details followed a pattern that felt almost insulting in its normality. Cleaning, sorting supplies, carrying crates, nothing designed to punish, nothing designed to break us. The sun was hot, the air heavy, but no one pushed us past the point of exhaustion. And always, there were enough guards. That was another thing that unsettled me. America, we had been told, was stretched thin, desperate, fighting on too many fronts, sending boys overseas faster than they could train them. And yet here, thousands of miles from the battlefield, there were guards enough to rotate shifts, to stand watch without shouting, to treat us as if control were not something that required force. They did not need terror to manage us. That realization lodged itself in my chest like a splinter. At night, whispers spread through the barracks. Maybe they're waiting until more arrive. They're softening us up. My cousin said camps like this are only temporary. We all clung to some version of the same thought. This cannot be real. Reality was more frightening than cruelty because cruelty at least fit the story we had been told. Kindness did not. One evening, after work, I returned to my cot and found my scarf folded differently than I had left it. Not missing, not damaged, just moved. My breath caught painfully in my throat. Someone had been there. I stood frozen, scanning the room, heart racing, waiting for anger to flood in. It didn't. No one said anything. No punishment followed. The scarf remained mine. Later, I realized the truth was far simpler and far more unsettling. The floor had been swept again. The cot straightened. My things moved because someone had been cleaning. Cleaning. A prisoner's living space. I sat down slowly, the weight of that realization pressing on me harder than any blow could have. Back home, by 1944, there had been nothing left to clean. Only rubble. Only absence. Mothers traded recipes for things that no longer existed. Fathers disappeared into uniforms and did not come back. And yet here, my enemy ensured the floor beneath my feet stayed clean. That night, I finally slept. Not because I felt safe, but because exhaustion won. When I woke, the fear was still there. It lived under my skin now, quieter but sharper, watching, measuring, waiting for the moment when the mask would fall. Because surely, I told myself, no nation could fight a global war and still afford this much restraint. Surely something was coming. And until it did, we waited. Not for kindness, but for what we had been promised all along. The waiting did not end with violence. That was the problem. After days, then weeks of bracing myself for the moment the truth would finally reveal itself, nothing happened. No beatings, no interrogations, No speeches, no lectures about democracy, freedom, or why we had been wrong and they had been right. Instead, there was breakfast. Every morning, at the same time. Not ceremonially, not as a reward, just reliably. That was the first crack in something I had believed was unbreakable. Because cruelty is dramatic. It announces itself. Kindness that arrives quietly, without explanation, is far more destabilizing. The routine settled in before I realized it was happening. A bell, not harsh, not shrill, marked the start of the day. Tin cups appeared, already warm from coffee poured too quickly. Bread followed. Sometimes eggs. Sometimes oatmeal thick enough to stand a spoon in. Always enough to silence hunger before it had time to speak. I learned the numbers later. We all did. 3,000, sometimes 3,200 calories a day. More than my mother had eaten in years. At first, I refused to finish my plate, not openly. I would slow down, leave small portions untouched, watching to see what would happen. Nothing did. No one scolded me. No one forced me to eat. No one accused me of ingratitude or sabotage. The food was simply taken away, and the next morning, another full plate appeared. It felt like a test designed by someone who understood patience better than fear. Work assignments came next. Not punishment details, not humiliation labor, just work. Farms first. Florida soil clung to everything. Boots, hems, skin. We picked, carried, sorted. Oranges so bright they looked artificial. Crates stamped with names of towns I had never heard of, bound for places even farther away. The sun was relentless, but water was constant. Breaks were enforced, not negotiated. Later came warehouses, stacking, inventory. Labels in English that began to make sense through repetition rather than instruction. Then the rail lines. I remember standing near the tracks one afternoon, watching a freight train thunder past, boxcars stretching farther than my eyes could follow. The ground vibrated under my feet. Someone beside me whispered almost reverently, "How many?" I didn't answer because I didn't know which question she was asking. How many cars? How many factories? How many people did it take to keep something like this moving? No one explained America to us. They didn't have to. It explained itself. Men my age were overseas, fighting. You could feel their absence in the way the guards worked longer shifts, in the tired eyes of the supervisors, in the letters some of them read quietly during breaks. Women filled the gaps. We saw them everywhere, on trucks, in offices, overseeing machinery, carrying clipboards with the same authority men once had. Their hair was tied back, their hands strong, their movements efficient. They did not look heroic. They looked necessary. Later, I learned the phrase Americans used for it, the arsenal of democracy. At the time, I only knew that everything around me worked. Trains ran, food arrived, tools were repaired instead of discarded. People showed up and did their jobs without ceremony. There was no banner declaring greatness, just an overwhelming sense of capacity. And we, enemy soldiers, were folded into it. Not as symbols, not as trophies, as labor. That, more than anything, frightened me. We were paid, not much, but consistently. Camp script, they called it. Paper coupons stamped with numbers, redeemable at the camp canteen. Soap, writing paper, toothpaste, occasionally candy. Money for work done. Not privilege, not charity. Payment. One afternoon, I stood at the counter holding a small bar of chocolate I had bought with my own earnings. The clerk, a young American woman with grease on her sleeves, did not look at me with suspicion or pity. She rang it up. That was all. Back in the barracks, I sat on my cot and stared at the chocolate until my hands shook. In Germany, chocolate had become something whispered about. A memory, a thing for children in old photographs. Here, I had bought it. The system was brutally simple. Work was expected. Work was valued. Work was compensated. No ideology required. That night, lying on my cot, I tried to remember the last time anyone had trusted me to simply do my job. In Germany, by the end, everything came with a lecture, every task wrapped in slogans, every failure framed as betrayal. We were told what to think before we were told what to do. Here, no one seemed to care what I believed, only whether I showed up, only whether I worked. That realization landed slowly, like a bruise you don't notice until you move the wrong way. No one tried to re-educate us. No one gathered us in a hall and explained freedom. They didn't show films. They didn't hand out pamphlets. They didn't ask us to denounce anything or anyone. They fed us. They worked us. They paid us. And then they went home. One afternoon, as we were unloading crates near the rail depot, an older American supervisor handed me a pair of gloves. Thick leather, worn soft with use. He didn't smile, didn't lecture, just held them out. "Tracks get hot," he said. I took them automatically. Only later did it occur to me what hadn't happened. He hadn't explained why America was better. He hadn't told me what I should think. He had simply assumed I would want to protect my hands. That assumption, that I was capable, rational, worth equipping rather than controlling, cut deeper than any argument could have. It contradicted everything I had been taught. In Germany, power announced itself through domination. Here, power moved like infrastructure, invisible, constant, impersonal. By late summer, the fear that had once consumed me began to change shape. It didn't disappear. It evolved. I stopped waiting for the blow. I started wondering what it meant that it never came. One evening, after dinner, I counted the days on the calendar. Sunday circled again. Another week gone. I tried to imagine what this place looked like from the outside. A nation fighting across two oceans, feeding its own people, feeding its soldiers, feeding even its prisoners, without collapsing into chaos. I thought of my mother, standing in line for bread that might not arrive, of factories reduced to rubble, of speeches that grew louder as the shelves grew emptier. Here, there were no speeches, just systems that worked. That night, I wrote a letter home. The censors would read it. I knew that. So I chose my words carefully. I did not write about abundance. I did not write about chocolate. I did not write about gloves. I wrote only this: I am working. I am fed. I am not harmed. It felt like a lie. Not because it was false, but because it was incomplete. The truth was harder to explain. America was not trying to win my mind. It didn't need to. It was winning by function, by restraint, by trusting that if you treat people like workers instead of enemies, something irreversible happens. And somewhere between the morning coffee and the evening roll call, between the rails and the orange crates, I began to understand a terrifying possibility. This was not weakness. This was how America won wars. Not just by defeating armies, but by making cruelty unnecessary. It happened on a morning that looked like every other morning. That was the cruelty of it. After weeks of routine, coffee steam rising from aluminum pots, work details posted on clipboards, the soft thud of boots on swept wooden floors, I had begun to believe that time itself had settled into something predictable. Fear had dulled. Suspicion had learned to live quietly in the background. Life, even here, had found a shape. So when the sound reached us, it took a moment to register. A bell. Not the camp bell, not the work bell. A church bell. It drifted in from beyond the trees, slow and measured, carried on humid Florida air. One toll, then another, not urgent, not panicked, ceremonial. We froze. Someone whispered, "Why are they ringing?" Another bell joined it, then another, farther away. The sound layered itself across the morning, spreading like ripples across water. Then came the radio. A guard had turned it up near the administrative building, the volume louder than usual. The announcer's voice cut through the air, clear, confident, unmistakably American. Has unconditionally surrendered. For a heartbeat, the words meant nothing. Then they meant everything. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. I waited for my body to react, for relief to wash over me, for joy for tears. None came. Instead, my chest tightened so suddenly I thought I might collapse where I stood. Around me, the barracks had gone silent. Not the heavy silence of fear, but something hollow, as if the sound had knocked the air out of us all at once. Somewhere outside, an American soldier let out a whoop. Another laughed. Boots shuffled faster than usual. Someone slapped someone else on the back. Victory! That was what this was supposed to feel like. But inside the barracks, we did not move. We sat on our cots, hands folded, staring at the floorboards we had learned so well. The same boards that had been swept every morning. The same boards that now felt unsteady beneath my feet. Germany had lost. I tried to picture what that meant. Not maps, not flags, homes, my mother's apartment, if it still stood. The bakery on the corner that had been requisitioned, then bombed. The neighbors who disappeared one by one, drafted, buried, scattered. I thought of letters that had stopped coming months ago. I thought of kitchens without food, of winter coats traded for potatoes, of streets I would no longer recognize even if I returned. And then I thought of where I was sitting. A barracks with intact walls, regular meals, guards who did not shout. Work that made sense. The contrast struck me so violently I had to put my head between my knees. This was not supposed to happen. We were supposed to endure captivity and then go home. But home no longer existed in the way we understood it. Outside, the bells kept ringing. The radio played again. Music this time. Upbeat, familiar American melodies drifting across the camp. Somewhere, someone was singing along. Inside, no one sang. One woman began to cry, not loudly, just a soft, broken sound, like air escaping a punctured tire. Another pressed her lips together so tightly they turned white. No one tried to comfort anyone else. We were all trapped in the same realization. The war was over, and we had nowhere to return to that resembled what we had lost. I stood and walked to the window. Outside, American soldiers gathered in loose clusters. They smiled. They shook hands. One man lit a cigarette and passed it along. Their laughter was real, but it was not cruel. They did not look toward us, did not point, did not mock. They celebrated among themselves. That, somehow, made it worse. Because if they had jeered, if they had shouted triumph in our direction, I could have retreated into the familiar shape of hatred. I could have told myself that this was how enemies behaved. But they didn't. They allowed us our silence. The radio crackled again. Victory in Europe. The phrase echoed in my head, empty and heavy. Victory meant survival for them. Defeat meant return. For us. And return meant hunger, displacement, ruins. I felt my breathing grow shallow. Each breath seemed to stop halfway in, as if my lungs refused to accept what my ears had heard. My hands began to shake. I pressed them against the window frame, the smooth wood grounding me in the present. This place, this impossible, orderly place, had kept me alive. Not as a favor, as policy, as routine, as something so mundane it had felt almost accidental. Now, suddenly, it was temporary. The realization broke something open inside me. I slid down to sit on the floor, my back against the wall, knees drawn up. My chest burned. I could hear my own heartbeat louder than the bells. Across the room, a woman whispered, "What happens now?" No one answered, because the answer was unbearable. Now, we would be sent back to a country that had spent its last reserves on destruction instead of systems. Back to streets that would not be swept in the morning. Back to kitchens without coffee. Back to survival without structure. Outside, an American guard walked past the window. He slowed when he saw us sitting there. For a moment, his expression softened. Not pity, not triumph. Something closer to understanding. He did not come in. He did not speak. He simply kept walking. That restraint, the same restraint we had been experiencing for months, was the final blow. They had won. They did not need to prove it. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the girl I had been before the war. The one who believed in slogans because she had nothing else to believe in. The one who thought power had to shout to be real. That girl felt very far away. When I opened my eyes again, the bells had stopped. The radio played on. Life, it seemed, was already reorganizing itself around victory. But inside the barracks, we remained still. Because for the first time since my capture, I understood the full weight of what America had given me. Not intentionally, not symbolically, but simply by being what it was. A place where order survived war. A place where defeat did not automatically mean humiliation. And as that understanding settled in, I felt something I had not expected at all. Not relief, not gratitude, but grief, sharp and sudden, for a country I was about to leave, and for a home I no longer knew how to return to. That was the moment I couldn't breathe. Not because the war had ended, but because I had realized where I had been safest, and how fragile that safety truly was. The panic did not vanish after the bells stopped ringing. It settled, like dust after a building collapses, quiet, unavoidable, coating everything. For days after the announcement, we moved through our routines as if the war had not ended at all. Breakfast still arrived on time. Work details were posted at the same hour. The guards changed shifts with the same precision. Nothing accelerated, nothing unraveled. That was the moment I began to understand what I was really living inside. Not mercy, not generosity, competence. The Americans did not tighten control after victory. They did not loosen it either. They simply continued. And that continuity did something far more devastating to everything I had been taught than punishment ever could. In Germany, power had always announced itself. It shouted, it demanded. It reminded you, constantly, that it could hurt you if it wished. Control came from fear. Fear of being watched, fear of being reported, fear of being replaced. Even as the shelves emptied and the bombs fell closer, the voice on the radio grew louder, more desperate, more cruel. Strength, we were told, required hardness. Here, in this camp thousands of miles from the battlefield, strength felt indifferent. The guards did not glare. They did not posture. They did not need to. They arrived on time. That detail mattered more than anything else. Every shift change happened when it was supposed to. Every work crew moved when the clipboard said it would. Meals were served whether the guards were in a good mood or not. Rules were enforced without theatrics. No one tried to scare us into obedience. They assumed it, and we gave it to them, without realizing when or how. I watched the guards closely after the war ended, expecting something to change, for resentment to surface, for triumph to harden their faces. It didn't. They still spoke little, still avoided unnecessary contact, still treated us like a problem that had already been solved. One morning, as we lined up for work detail, a guard noticed my boots were coming apart at the sole. He crouched, tapped the leather once, then stood. "Get replacements after shift," he said. Not a suggestion, not a threat, a statement. I nodded and stepped forward. That was it. No lecture about responsibility, no comment about my status as an enemy, just a problem identified, and a solution provided. That kind of authority did not exist where I came from. In Germany, by the end, nothing was allowed to be simple. Every small action was loaded with meaning. Every correction came wrapped in ideology. You were never just late, you were disloyal. You were never just tired, you were weak. Here, fatigue was expected. Mistakes were corrected. Work continued. One afternoon, I was assigned to a warehouse crew loading crates onto a truck. The sun pressed down hard, the air thick with heat and the smell of oil. My arms ached. My hands slipped on the wood. I slowed. The supervisor, a civilian, not a soldier, noticed immediately. He looked at his watch, then at the stack of crates. 5-minute water break, he said. No accusation, no judgment, just an adjustment to keep the work moving. I drank from my canteen and felt something inside me fracture cleanly, like ice breaking under steady pressure. They were not kind to us because they were sentimental. They were kind because cruelty would have been inefficient. That was the realization I could not escape. In Germany, fear was used to extract obedience. Here, order produced it naturally, and order came from full stomachs, predictable rules, and a shared understanding that tomorrow would look more or less like today. The camp commander embodied it perfectly. I had seen him only a handful of times. A middle-aged man, plain uniform, no medals on display. When he spoke, it was brief. One afternoon, a disagreement broke out between two prisoners over a work assignment. Voices rose, tempers flared. The guards stepped closer, but did not intervene. The commander arrived quietly, listened for less than a minute, then spoke 5 words. Work done is work done. That was all. No investigation, no punishment. The men separated and returned to their tasks. The argument ended not because of fear, but because it no longer mattered. I thought of Germany again, of endless meetings, of loyalty tests, of speeches delivered while the trains stopped running and the factories lay in ruins. We had confused intensity for strength. Here, strength wore a wristwatch and spoke softly. As the days passed, my resentment weakened, not because I forgave America, but because there was nothing to push against. Hatred needs friction. It needs cruelty to justify itself. Here, there was only structure. I began to notice things I had ignored before. How the guards ate the same food we did. How they complained about heat, not prisoners. How letters from home left them silent, not vengeful. Many of them had brothers overseas. Some had sons. They did not punish us for that. They worked, they waited. They trusted systems larger than themselves. That, more than any speech, dismantled the final defenses inside me. One evening, as I returned my camp script to my pocket after buying soap, I realized something terrifying in its simplicity. I was obeying, not because I was afraid. I was obeying because the rules made sense, because my needs were met, because resistance would have been irrational. No one had broken me. No one had tried. And that was the point. This was a country that did not need broken enemies to prove its power. It had factories running day and night, farms producing more than they could consume, rail lines stitching the continent together, women building bombers, men fighting overseas, and here, behind wire, enough order left over to treat prisoners like workers instead of animals. The war had demanded everything from them, and they still had restraint to spare. That was the moment pride shifted, not toward them alone, but toward an idea I had never encountered before. That authority could be quiet, that discipline could exist without terror, that victory did not require humiliation. When I lay down that night, listening to the familiar sounds of the camp settling into sleep, I understood something I had not been prepared to understand. Power that must shout is already afraid. Power that feeds you, pays you, and expects you to work does not need your fear. It already has your respect. And somewhere, far beyond the barbed wire, I imagined American families sitting down to dinner, simple meals, unremarkable by their standards, while a war that had consumed half the world slowly drew to a close. They would remember victory as something earned through sacrifice. I would remember it as something revealed through restraint. That difference mattered, because long after uniforms were folded and borders redrawn, one truth would remain, unarguable and heavy in my chest. They didn't need to break us. For a long time after I left the camp, I tried not to think about America. That was easier than admitting how deeply it had marked me. I returned to Germany thin, older than my years, carrying memories that did not fit neatly into the ruins around me. There was too much to rebuild. Homes, families, trust itself. Survival demanded focus. Reflection felt like a luxury. So I folded those months away. I married, I worked, I raised children. The war became something spoken of in careful sentences, or not at all. but memory has a way of waiting. 20 years later, I saw America again, this time through photographs in a magazine left behind on a train seat. Black and white images of smiling families in the 1940s. Factory floors crowded with women in coveralls. Men standing shoulder to shoulder beside machines larger than houses. The same country that had fed me while fighting a war on 2 fronts. Another 10 years passed, then 20 more. And one autumn afternoon, nearly 50 years after I first smelled coffee in that Florida barracks, I stood in a small American town I had never heard of before. The factory was closed. Its windows were broken, glass glittering like frost on the concrete below. The gate hung crooked on its hinges. A sign, once painted proudly, had rusted into something barely readable. Wind moved through the weeds that had claimed the parking lot, brushing against old tire marks that led nowhere now. I stood there longer than I meant to. This, too, was America, but it was not the one I remembered. In 1944, America had felt impossibly solid, unified by necessity, driven by purpose. People argued, certainly, but not about whether they belonged to the same future. Back then, everything pointed forward. Factories roared. Trains ran. Hands were needed everywhere. Women stepped into roles that had never been offered to them before. Men crossed oceans believing, rightly or wrongly, that what waited behind them was worth defending. Even enemies were folded into the system, fed, housed, used productively, respected enough to be expected to work. Now, decades later, I saw wondering. What happened to that America? I did not write the last words of this story. My grandchildren did. That is how I know it ends the right way. The letter arrived decades after the war, folded carefully, written in a younger hand that had never known hunger or air raid sirens. It came with questions at first, gentle ones. Where were you held? Were you afraid? Is it true you worked on farms in America? I answered what I could. Not everything. Some memories are better carried than explained. But one question returned again and again, in different forms. Why did you never speak with bitterness about America? So my grandchildren began to write on their own. They wrote to museums, to local historical societies, to American veterans organizations whose addresses they found tucked into archives and footnotes. They did not ask for forgiveness. They did not explain our side of the war. They did not argue history. They wrote thank you letters, simple ones. My grandmother was a prisoner in the United States. She was fed when her country could not feed her. She was treated with dignity when the world was losing its own. We are alive in part because of that. Some letters received replies, some did not, but a few came back with handwriting that trembled slightly. Ink pressed hard into paper. I was a guard in a camp in Florida. I remember the coffee. We just did our jobs. I'm glad it mattered. Those words stayed with me longer than any medal or monument ever could, because they confirmed what I had always known. What happened in those camps was not an accident. It was not the kindness of a few exceptional men. It was the byproduct of a country that believed restraint was strength, that systems mattered, that even enemies were still people. My grandchildren never apologized in those letters. They did not excuse the war. They did not soften its crimes. They simply said, thank you. That mattered. Gratitude, I learned, is not the same as absolution. It does not rewrite history. It does not balance scales that can never truly be balanced. It honors choices. And the choice America made, over and over again, quietly, without applause, was to remain itself even while winning. Years later, one of my grandchildren visited the United States. She stood in a small local museum, looking at photographs of men in uniform, women at factory lines, prisoners standing in neat rows behind wire. She told me she recognized something in their faces. Not pride exactly, not sorrow either. Resolve, a belief that doing the right thing did not require permission. She wrote to me afterward. They didn't act like heroes, she said. They acted like people who expected the world to keep working tomorrow. That expectation was the gift. It fed us. It steadied us. Country that seemed to argue with itself more than it worked. In diner conversations overheard by accident. In headlines that shouted instead of explained. In towns like this one, half empty, half forgotten, where people looked backward with anger instead of forward with resolve. The contrast unsettled me. In 1944, Americans had found a way to stay united even while the world burned. Now, with no world war demanding everything of them, they seemed divided over almost anything. I thought of the guards at the camp, men who did not talk much, who showed up on time, who followed rules because the rules made sense, who did not need to humiliate prisoners to feel powerful. They had been young then. Many of them were likely gone now, but the values they carried had built something vast and durable. I wondered if it was those values, or merely the circumstances that had held the country together. Walking past the shuttered factory, I imagined what it must have sounded like when it was alive. Machines humming, shift whistles blowing, workers pouring out at the end of the day, tired but certain that tomorrow would come and bring more of the same. Certainty had been America's quiet strength. Even as a prisoner, I had felt it. You could lose a battle, but not the system. Now, standing amid rust and silence, I wondered when certainty had begun to slip. In the camp, Americans had respected their enemies enough to treat them humanely. Now, it seemed, Americans struggled to respect one another. I did not say this aloud. It was not my place to judge. But the question stayed with me. What happened to the country that could fight fascism abroad without abandoning decency at home? What happened to the confidence that allowed them to be generous even in victory? The America I knew in 1944 had not been perfect, but it had been coherent. Purpose stitched people together. Industry gave them common ground. Shared sacrifice created patience. That coherence had made mercy possible. Looking at the closed factory, I felt a quiet ache, not only for what America had lost, but for what the world had lost with it, because that version of America had not just won a war. It had shown what power could look like when it was disciplined, restrained, and sure of itself. I turned away and continued down the street. The town was quiet. A few cars passed. Life went on, differently now. But somewhere beneath the noise of arguments and the weight of disappointment, I believed that old America still existed, not as nostalgia, but as memory. And memory, I had learned, was dangerous in the best possible way. It asked questions. It refused to let us forget what we were once capable of being. As I left the town behind, one thought followed me, heavy and unresolved. If America could once remain united enough to treat its enemies with dignity, what excuse did it have now for failing to do the same for itself? That question was not an accusation. It was an inheritance. And like all inheritances, it demanded to be faced, not with anger, but with honesty. That was the legacy I carried with me. Not bitterness, but a quiet, persistent. It sent us home alive. Long after the barbed wire came down, long after uniforms were folded and stored away, that gift did not rust. It passed from generation to generation, not as a lesson carved in stone, but as a standard quietly upheld. When my grandchildren speak of America, they do not speak of victory parades or battlefields. They speak of water, handed across a fence, of work gloves offered without comment, of coffee in the morning, brewed for prisoners as routinely as for guards. They speak of a country strong enough to win, and calm enough not to gloat. That is why, when this story ends, it does not end with triumph. It ends with memory, with gratitude, with a recognition that the measure of a nation is not only how it defeats its enemies, but how it treats them when it no longer has to prove anything at all. So I leave the last words where they belong, not with history books, but with family. With a sentence my grandchildren now know by heart, passed down as carefully as any heirloom. History remembers who won the war, but my family remembers who gave us water and asked for nothing in return.